You've made it to the last segment here on chapter 31, which is pre 1750 Tokugawa Japan, and then how Japan changes to respond to industrialization. Japan had recently, or I guess fairly recently compared to China, experienced centralized authority under the Tokugawa shogunate. Remember, this was called Senkoku. Um, they had limited trade and influence with Europeans, famously in Nagasaki with the Dutch. Remember, we read the edict in class. And then the peace that Tokugawa had brought also brought about prosperity, especially for merchants and farmers. And Japan had a history of adapting and modernizing and modifying ideas. You can see two examples of this with Chinese script and Buddhism. So they would take something and make it their own. All right. So from the early 1750s to the early 1900s, the Tokugawa shogunate weakened and then fell. This was because of internal turmoil. The Tokugawa government was experiencing low crop yields and therefore low taxes. So that weakened the government. Also, samurais were really in debt and impoverished and really fed up by that, so they rebelled. They didn't have enough money to institute successful reforms. They didn't have enough political capital, really, to institute successful reforms. So those unsuccessful reforms, which covered the gambit from government to taxation, were put by the wayside. And in addition to that, they were pressured to open up to trade with the West by Americans. Commodore Matthew Perry, who arrived in Japan in 1853 under the pretense of getting some soldiers. This is gunboat. He came in 1953, and he brought the big guns. So he said he would return a year later, and if they weren't ready to open themselves up to trade with the Americas, then they could expect a fight. So they did, and this led to a civil war. And the Civil War was won by the party in opposition, or by the group in opposition to the Tokugawa shogunate, and they installed emperor who was already still emperor, Mushohito, who is also called Meiji, bright, or excuse me, this like enlightened revolution. That happened in 1868, and the opposition, like I said, triumphed, and they put the emperor in power. But remember, the power behind the throne, it was what mattered. They went about adapting many Western style ideas. They saw how far they were behind the Americans, and because of this, Japanese traveled to Europe and the Americas, studying our government, military, economy, and they brought all those ideas back to Japan and installed different reforms there. For example, they studied constitutions and decided on the German model. They started a representative body called the Diet, but let's be clear, this was very limited. In the first voting in 1898, only 5% of the population could vote for representatives in the Diet. They changed around the districts to the type of districts that Japan has today, and they also monetized taxes. So basically they said, instead of, oh, I wonder how you're supposed to spell that. Instead of paying in rice, you were going to pay in money, and you were going to be taxed based on the size of your land, not yearly yields. This was a very good thing for the government because it steadied finances. Last but not least, they, like I said, they had studied industry. So they went around and they found the best types of industry that they could do, and they put it into place. This was done with what were called saibatsu, or financial cliques, who were given huge concessions by the government. So again, this is state directed, just like in Russia, and um, they are making things easier for these different families. Mitsubishi would be like an example of a financial clique. Japan built huge amounts of railroads and factories. It was extremely successful from an industrial standpoint, and it led to them having imperial ambitions. So they are able to take over Korea, Manchuria from the Russians and the Chinese. They're able to take over many islands and expand their imperial ambitions because, of course, as an island, they need resources. Okay, so let's learn a little bit more about these successes in the next couple of slides, and then we'll be done. Here we have the Commodore Matthew Perry's fleet coming into the Japanese harbor, and here is a, excuse me, depiction of Commodore Matthew Perry, a woodblock painting, and here he is with some of his advisors. There's plenty of pictures of this from an American perspective, but I thought I'd show you like the main picture. But I thought I'd also show you a couple of Japanese ones too, just to show how he was depicted and how Americans were depicted. All right, so here is Emperor Mushihito, or Emperor Meiji. This is taken of him in his traditional emperor habit. Here we have, just a few years later, that is one impressive hat, my friend. Wow. Here, just a few years later, you see quite the difference, don't you? The pants, the hat, still got a samurai sword, but things are much different. And that did not just extend to Mushihito, it extended to his whole family. Yeah, his kids look like they're wearing fairly Japanese dress, but his wife and his older son and daughter are definitely Western here. They did things like learn how to ballroom dance. It's pretty sweet. So it wasn't just political or economic revitalization, it was also cultural. Here we have an armory. Like I said, the military of Japan was westernized. They brought in soldiers from the Americas after the Civil War to teach them about these new military tactics. And interestingly, they still carried in ceremonial samurai swords, although they were produced in factories, so they were pretty crappy. This is a university baseball team. Pretty neat. Baseball also came into Japan at this time. This is a picture of the Diet. And here, it's probably the most impressive, you see the fruits of industrialism, excuse me. Here we have raw silk production and export from Japan. Impressive. That is a large increase. Here we have length of railroad track. I'll draw another one of these. Wow. In 1872, there are 29 kilometers or 18 miles of railroad track, and in 1914, there are over 7,000. That is pretty impressive. And last but not least, we have the size of the merchant fleet, so number of steamships. Again, wow, very impressive. So, on the flipped classroom, I'm going to ask you who you think was the most successful in dealing with internal and external pressures, and for evidence and why you think that is. least successful, and how does this chapter show the global shifting power dynamics of period 5? And what are the reasons for it, for that? So we'll be discussing those things in class as well. Please fill out the listening checks and have a wonderful